Cower, brief mortals, for in this, the third episode of the GOAT project, we stand in the presence of greatness, a graphics card many have already proclaimed to hold the title of the greatest of all time. But will it live up to these sky-high expectations? I have to admit, the GTX 1080 Ti was the whole reason I started the GOAT project. I saw Gamers Nexus and Hardware Unboxed hailing the Pascal flagship as the best GPU ever, and my own video about the 1080 Ti called it a glorious mistake, so clearly there was a lot of hype to either be confirmed or dispelled. Considering how iterative previous GeForce generations had been, the GTX 1080 Ti was refreshingly OTT. It was an upgrade in almost every metric. It featured a node shrink compared to Kepler and Maxwell 2, a more densely packed GPU die compared to the 980 Ti, and a massive leap from 6 to 11GB of VRAM, all while sustaining the same 250W TDP. A lot of the current positive feeling around the 1080 Ti would come from hindsight. Subsequent GPU generations would try to bleed enthusiasts dry, and in fact, the Titan series was already evidence that Nvidia wanted to attract wealthier customers to the gaming market, but the 1080 Ti was actually relatively affordable, at least on paper. Real-world pricing wasn't always so attractive, but compared to what would follow, this is still a relative bargain, especially considering how relevant it's remained in the 7 years since its release. 250 watts isn't a low TGP these days, and in the modern era efficiency is very important, especially in countries where the cost of electricity has skyrocketed, but when modern 70 watt cards are still less than half as powerful as the 1080 Ti, and modern games are built for at least 8GB of VRAM, the maths aren't quite so simple. My sample here is, believe it or not, an EVGA Superclock 2, though the previous owner has replaced the stock heatsink with a Ryzen Tech Morpheus and a pair of Arctic 120mm fans. What could possibly go up against the King? Well, this generation was the one where AMD gave up chasing the pole position and started acting like the underdog. The Vega 64 was not a bad GPU. In fact, thanks to rock-bottom second-hand prices these days, I actually think it's a pretty decent pickup on a budget. However, that's not the context I'm judging these GPUs by. On the day it launched, Vega was already late to the party. When Nvidia first released Pascal in 2016, the only answer AMD had was Polaris, which competed with the middle-of-the-road GTX 1060. When Vega finally turned up in 2017, it was not only the year after the GTX 1080, the model it ostensibly competed with, but also several months behind the 1080 Ti. Not that there weren't some things to celebrate, Vega marked the return of HBM, this time HBM2, which was now on a 2048-bit bus compared to the Fury X's 4096, but the higher clock speeds went a long way to compensating for this. Moreover, the GCN5 architecture allowed for 50% higher core clocks than the GCN3 card, which, thanks to the 14nm process, meant the TDP climbed by just 20 watts. This was still some 45 watts higher than the reference 1080 Ti, however, and by now I think AMD were content with losing the efficiency battle too. End users did rather quickly find out that AMD were overestimating Vega's power requirements, so it's nowadays standard practice for Vega 64 owners to undervolt their cards, potentially bringing consumption down below 200 watts without sacrificing performance. My sample for the test is a Sapphire Nitro Plus, and while I try to avoid developing any kind of brand fandom myself, I do consider myself to be a bit of a Sapphire enjoyer. They could release an RX 9000 card with this exact cooler, and most people wouldn't even question it. As usual, the games being tested are from the year of release, as well as the year their predecessor was launched. I'd normally test them out in the year they were replaced by a newer model, but as the next generation of AMD and Nvidia cards came out in different years, I've opted for titles from 2019 rather than 2018 to better represent performance in next-gen games. In 2015, games were really starting to embrace 8th generation consoles, and the PC port of Assassin's Creed Syndicate was relatively hard to run on older hardware at higher settings. This generation would prove more than up to the challenge, with both the 1080 Ti and Vega 64 capable of running 1080p at over 100 FPS. The 1080 Ti naturally outperforms the Vega, as you'd hope, but the 20% performance margin isn't as big as you might expect. Turning up the resolution extends the GeForce's lead by a bit, with 1440p remaining over 100 FPS compared to 76 on the Radeon. At 4K, the Vega can only give a somewhat limited experience without dropping from high, whereas the 1080 Ti can hold on to 60+ without compromise. The difference between GPUs in The Witcher 3 is gargantuan. I don't focus too much on 1% lows in these comparisons because it's only very occasionally a problem, but I like to point out that the 1080 Ti's percentile lows are higher than the Vega's average. The 190 FPS average at 1080p is not completely CPU limited. Thank you 3D Vcache, but I feel like you couldn't really get much higher than this without resorting to frame generation. The Vega is still incredibly smooth at 133 FPS, but that is 30% lower than the 1080 Ti and a couple frames lower than the GeForce can manage at 1440p. At higher resolutions, the Vega 64 is still playable at 1440p, but Bro falls off massively at 4K. Meanwhile, the Pascal card is still very playable at over 70 FPS. For an ostentatiously Nvidia-sponsored title, Arkham Knight's results are unexpected. At 1080p, the sub 10% difference between the two cards isn't too surprising. I've deliberately chosen to leave PhysX turned off to avoid handing anyone an advantage, but we're pretty close to being CPU limited at these settings. At 1440p, there's a more realistic difference, with the 1080 Ti now over 20% faster, though this is only truly relevant in the benchmark utility, as the game has a 90 FPS cap, and disabling it has been reported to cause performance problems over time. At 4K, the gap in the averages shrinks to just under 20%, but what's more interesting to me is the second bar. The Vega card has significantly better frame pacing than the GeForce. Like I said, the game has FPS caps, so you shouldn't notice this in real-world gameplay, but it's still interesting. GTA 5 presents a problem for this project. At 188 FPS, the engine starts to break down, causing massive stuttering. The previous gen 980 Ti could reach over 160 FPS at 1080p high, so the significantly more powerful 1080 Ti is in danger of hitting that self-destruct switch. If I weren't trying to keep things even between GPUs, I'd normally just turn up settings. GTA 5's PC port has plenty of game-breakingly demanding graphics settings that can make it struggle on even 2024 hardware, so it should be possible to stay at a safe frame rate without resorting to FPS limiters and getting better graphics in the process. Because I am trying to keep parity between multiple cards, I used RTSS to limit the frame rates. After some experimentation, I found that 179 FPS only gave very occasional stutters, which meant my 1% lows were 178, but my 0.1s were single digits. So in real-world gaming, you'd still be better off limiting your FPS to 144. The Vega, meanwhile, has the disadvantage in this title of not being a GeForce, so while it doesn't need any caps, this is because it's scarcely any faster than the 980 Ti was. At 1440p, the 1080 Ti is still disconcertingly close to the danger zone at 174 FPS, but the Vega is only around the 120 mark. The 4K numbers show both cards are fully capable of playing GTA 5, though there's still a big difference between the two. Dirt Rally was capable of some very high FPS on the 2015 era flagships, and these 2017 cards are bordering on obscene. The 1080 Ti passes 350 FPS, occasionally being somewhat limited by the CPU, but still some 25% higher than the Vega 64. At 1440p, the GeForce is still higher than the Radeon was at 1080p, but we're talking about such big numbers that outside of this competitive context, you'd still be very happy with the Vega's 224 FPS. 4K is a pretty big drop-off, with the 1080 Ti scoring over 40% more frames than the Vega 64, though, again, it's still 120 FPS. I don't know many people who complain about that. Celebrating the birth year of both cards with Assassin's Creed Origins, a real system melter from 2017 that struggled with even some of the best CPUs at the time. So, not for the first time, we're looking at frame rates that would have been basically impossible back in the day. The 1080p results heavily favour the Geforce, averaging over 100 FPS next to the Radeon's 75. At 1440p, the Vega starts to show its limitations, as it can only just squeeze over 60 FPS, while the Pascal card is still in the mid-80s. At 4K, the 1080 Ti is a very playable, if not optimal, 55 FPS, while the Vega is hanging around the high 30s. Middle-earth Shadow of War isn't a game I'd ever really thought of as causing trouble for GPUs, but it turns out that it's performing similarly to AC Origins, at least on the 1080 Ti. At 1080p it's once more over the 100 FPS mark, with the Vega doing a little better this time at a shade under 90. At 1440p, the 1080 Ti is again in the low 80s, and the Vega just scrapes over 60 once again. And neither card is particularly great at 4K, with the Nvidia coming just under 50 FPS and the AMD just under 40. Strategy games aren't known for requiring high frame rates to enjoy, so I'm inclined to call any experience over 30 FPS to be playable, and in that regard, both cards do a fine job at every resolution. The 1080 Ti is hitting 140 FPS at 1080p, for all the good that does, and while the Vega is a long way short of that, it's still just about reaching the 100 mark. Turning up to 1440p sees the 1080 Ti drop to just below 100 FPS, and the Vega into the mid-60s. Stepping up to 2160p cuts those numbers virtually in half. Prey is a lighter weight game that ran pretty well on the previous gen cards, so it wasn't much of a driving force to convince gamers to upgrade in 2017. Nevertheless, the 1080 Ti generates some impressive numbers at 1080p, and for its part, the Vega's holding its own too, probably benefiting in this matchup thanks to a CPU limitation. At 1440p the bottleneck eases up a bit, and the Geforce is almost 50% faster than the Radeon, with both still surpassing 100 FPS. The margin's the same at 4K, though this time the Vega drops a little below the 60 mark. The first major enemy you meet in this game is the small, fast-moving Mimic, so sub-60 FPS frame rates are maybe a slightly bigger deal than you might expect in an immersive sim. For Honor is also pretty lightweight for a 2017 game, especially one that's something of a live service style online experience that has seen a lot of updates since its initial launch. At 1080p, the 1080 Ti breaks past 200 FPS, while the Vega is still a high refresh worthy 150 plus. Speaking of high refresh rates, the 1080 Ti can hit 144 at 1440p, which makes it a perfect fit for a very popular kind of monitor, while the Vega 64 is still competitive at 100 FPS. At 4K, only the Geforce remains over 60 on average, while the Radeon is in PAL territory. In 2019, the Vega 64 was replaced at the top of the Radeon stack not once, but twice. The Radeon 7 was GCN's last hurrah, basically a pro-level workstation card repackaged into something more consumer-friendly. However, to many people it was a paper launch, global distribution was very limited, and even countries that did get stock only received very small numbers. For that reason, I won't be comparing the RTX 2080 Ti to the Radeon 7 next week. The RX 5700 XT launched just 5 months after the 7, and while something of a step down in some areas, it was the start of a new architecture and, could actually be purchased. The RTX 2080 Ti, meanwhile, had been on the shelves for almost a year by that point, and yet I think a lot of 1080 Ti owners were probably still quite skeptical about it, especially at its $1,000 asking price. Games in 2019 were still firmly entrenched in the 8th generation mentality, though we were starting to see the influence of Nvidia's ray tracing revolution creeping into the PC gaming market, trying to coerce gamers with deep pockets to upgrade. The first game I tested was Red Dead Redemption 2, one of the big console ports that would go on to dominate PC gaming for the next 5 years, and one that needed pretty selective tuning of the graphics sliders to properly balance quality and performance. I've done none of that today. Rockstar games are almost as bad as Capcom for messy menus that reset themselves for no reason, so to maintain my sanity, I just set everything to high. The 1080 Ti is definitely starting to feel the strain here. 2 years ago, 1080p was 100 FPS territory for this card, now it's in the mid-80s. The Vega 64 is pushing over 70, a little over 15% slower than the Geforce and still pretty playable. At 1440p, the Nvidia card can still hold up at over 60 FPS, whereas the AMD slips just under the line and would benefit from some more optimised settings. Meanwhile, at 4K, both cards are a long way short of 60, and I don't think even adjusting the sliders is going to completely recover that lost performance. Control was an early poster child for RTX graphics cards, featuring a host of ray-traced lighting and reflection options, as well as support for DLSS. Naturally, this being the early days of ray tracing, even the RTX 2080 Ti struggled to deliver a smooth experience with everything maxed out, but that wasn't entirely the fault of RT. Even without the fancy RTX effects, Control is a demanding game. At 1080p, the 1080 Ti hits 92 FPS, just 10% or so higher than in RDR2. The Vega 64 fares even worse, with its 75 FPS average only 2.5 frames better than in Rockstar's open world monster. At 1440p, both the Geforce and Radeon take a stumble. The 1080 Ti can't quite hit 60 FPS this time, and the Vega 64 is languishing at Peter Jackson's favourite 48 FPS. 4K is a non-option on both cards, with the Pascal hitting a barely playable 27 FPS and the Vega at a mere 22. Resident Evil 2 Remake. Okay, I messed up here. I should have checked the settings more closely. The RE games don't have low, medium and high presets. They're instead named things like Prioritize Performance. I chose Prioritize Graphics, which is the highest preset available on non-ray tracing GPUs, but I didn't realise that includes FSR Ultra. I didn't expect to see it, as I didn't expect FSR to be in a game this early. I reviewed FSR when it first launched on Resident Evil 8, 2 games after this one, and it didn't occur to me that they might have backported it. Alas, I didn't notice my error until I'd already tested 3 GPUs in 2 games. Now, FSR Ultra doesn't give a huge boost in performance over native rendering. It's just a 1.3 scaling factor after all, but it does mean for some quite obscenely high frame rates for a horror game. Anyway, the 1080 Ti hits an average of almost 240 FPS at 1080p, meanwhile the Vega 64 is only reaching 2/3 of this, a pathetic 160 FPS. At 1440p, the 1080 Ti matches that frame rate, while the Vega is still over 100. At 4K, the Nvidia card is still proving capable, while the AMD slips a little under the 60 mark. Once again, Metro Exodus was a flag carrier for ray tracing, especially the later enhanced edition of the game, which is still the only AAA RT exclusive title that comes to mind over half a decade into the RTX era. Still, as anyone who played the earlier Metro games knows, this series is Ukraine's version of Crysis, at least philosophically, with graphics settings that could potentially melt even the most powerful of PC hardware at the time, RTX or not. The outdoor scene at the end of the benchmark run takes a sledgehammer to the knees of any GPU that dares try it, and so while the 1080 Ti can manage almost 100 FPS on average at 1080p, the minimums fall to under 50. The Vega, meanwhile, is only reaching 75 FPS on average, and those demanding outdoor scenes drive it down into the console-esque range. At 1440p, the frame rates from the Geforce once more look like the Vega at 1080p, while the Vega looks borderline unplayable. At 4K, neither card is holding up particularly well, with 1% lows in the 20s on both sides. Borderlands 3 does a little better, with at least a more consistent experience across the benchmark run. At 1080p, the GTX 1080 Ti is still a 100+ experience, and while the Vega 64 is only capable of a near 80 FPS average, its 1% lows are at least still above 60. At 1440p, once more the GeForce graph looks like the Radeon at 1080p, and the Radeon dips below the 60 mark, though with steady enough frame pacing that I wouldn't call it unplayable. At 4K, you better recalibrate your expectations, as neither card is far from a console-like experience. Though, if you can get used to 30 FPS, both GPUs are broadly capable of delivering it. For raw performance then, it's not going to surprise anyone that the 1080 Ti walks away with it in this comparison, winning in each game at each resolution by a healthy margin. It would have taken a Vega 96 to be genuinely competitive with the Pascal flagship, and if AMD had somehow been able to find enough good silicon to make such a beast, then it would probably have been priced to compete with the Titan XP. Even the Radeon 7, the best AMD could make out of GCN even 2 years later, couldn't completely match the 1080 Ti. It's a legend for a reason. So, is that end of story? Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube stuff, yada yada. Well, I always talk about how important value for money is when judging the GOAT of graphics cards, and everyone always talks about what good value the 1080 Ti was compared to everything that followed. So, I guess it beats the Vega 64 there too, right? Nope. Okay, let's not overblow it. To be clear, the difference is often within the margin of error, and it's based on the MSRP of $699 for the 1080 Ti versus $499 for the Vega 64, and while this was pre-scalper pandemic, it's still not guaranteed that these prices were realistic. But, based purely on the numbers I can actually verify, the 1080 Ti is, overall, worse value than the Vega 64. In some specific cases, it still wins, for example at 4K in previous gen games, and at 1440 and 4K in current gen, but in the other 6 out of 9 tests, the Vega simply offers more frames per dollar. In my opinion, that isn't quite enough to win it for the Vega 64. External factors like the emerging importance of efficiency and VRAM in the 2020s have definitely contributed to the 1080 Ti's reputation as the GOAT. Meanwhile, Vega has been quietly shuffled onto legacy drivers, meaning that the only official updates it will receive now will be security ones, and in the near future will probably rely on third-party driver development to remain relevant in gaming. However, I think the results from this test are a warning. Maybe it's too early to be hanging out the victory banners for the 1080 Ti. The mighty Pascal card may yet turn out to be the GOAT, but it seems that it still has challengers, and they can be found in some unexpected places. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.